Welcome to Project Management Paradise. My name is Susanne and I'm your host today. And on today's episode, we are joined by Sachin Raje, who will be here with us to discuss how to lead a strategy realization office in life science, and a very relevant man to talk to us as he is the director of strategy realization with Merck. So Sachin, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you give us a bit of insight into your background? How did you, I suppose, get into project management, program management, and obviously now strategy realization?
Thank you, Susanne. Lovely to be here. The journey was very interesting. I started my career way back in R&D, but in electronics engineering, which is what my background was, and then starting off with leading my own company in computer-aided design, which was a completely different field, and that too in India, so writing a couple of books, and then in that field. And that was the field that I was in, and I never thought I would ever firstly be in the US, where I ended up. And there I realized that I needed to sort of have a different set of skills altogether, and I realized project management was the sort of link between the computer-aided design world and this world over here. So I started into project management, and very early on, and probably in the 1990s, late 1990s, I got a chance to set up what I called a project management office without knowing that such a term existed. And then from there on, as I did more work, got a chance to set up a few project management offices, and then the term morphed into program management. So we had, so I was lucky to head up a small company, which set up PMOs for companies. So there I got a chance to work with existing PMOs in mid-sized companies at the time. And got a chance to see what the problem areas were really in program management and project management, and then in the PMO structure, and got to learn about the various flavors of program management. And then the strategy realization office was a natural evolution. When I came to my current job, which is in Merck in global medical and scientific affairs, that's where we were going through a massive transformation, and they needed to have something which would sort of manage the transformations. So the strategy realization office concept. So I started this job in 2017, and Gartner kind of defined the term in 2019. I understand from John McGrath, who mentioned that. But for me, that the names and the terms are sort of loose, if you will. Like in the strategy realization office in the utopian world is somebody sitting right in the CEO's office, I guess, where you're actually taking strategy from there. But we took it as something which meant a department which is a 2,500 people group at that level, and then the strategy realization office for that group. So that was the kind of journey leading up into the strategy realization office, knowing that this was a different view than the traditional PMOs. It had to do something differently. So that's why we refused to be called the PMO, because we were doing something differently and wanted to do something differently. So that's where I got here.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you've worked across a number of industries, but focused on in the PMO side of things. And is there much of a difference within the PMO, within the different industries, or is there similarities across the board? Or can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So PMOs come in multiple flavors, as you well know, right? So you could have a functional PMO, which is aligned on the function that you're providing. It could be an enterprise PMO, which is truly at the top level, and kind of managing and setting directions. Or it could even be, for that matter, for a large project or large program. So for example, a divestiture of a company could have its own PMO, right? So there are different flavors of PMOs itself. And then depending on the kind of touch point that the PMO provides across the projects themselves. So we could have something, and PMI has terms for this. They classify as 3 different types of PMOs as well. Right from a low touch PM, which sort of sets up templates and guidances, to a midterm sort of PM, which has stage gates and those kind of things, and a little more process driven, and to a final high touch PMO, which is more, we'll manage all your projects and we provide all the PMs kind of thing. So from that perspective, across industries, you are going to see these various flavors and of PMs and of PMOs. That's a given. Um, in life sciences, what was significantly different, in my opinion, at least in the companies that I have had an occasion to work with, is that the PMOs tend to be more supportive of three different types of projects, right? So one of them is around the line of what I call operational projects, which is a contradiction of terms, I guess, because operations and projects are two different things. But there are more like the product development teams, for example, in some cases where you actually have a little more clear coordination driven kind of set of projects, which is one kind of PMOs, which is there in life sciences, which is a little different from what I've seen in some of the other industries. And the other being one where you have these PhDs leading the projects. So they're subject matter experts, and they sort of, you need that subject matter expertise, and you need that access into that club, if you will, of other PhDs and MDs in the pharmaceutical industries to say, oh, this is one of us who's managing a project. And that kind of a concept is true in other industries as well, that you have these technical project managers, if you will, SMEs in some cases, leading, becoming project managers. That kind of concept is similar, but in the life sciences side, it's a little more pronounced. And then, of course, there are the rare kind of projects, which are, unique programs, unique projects, transformational projects, one-of-a-kind bespoke projects, which, of course, other industries also have a lot of. But in the pharmaceutical world, what's different is the focus doesn't seem to be quite as much on money and in terms of budgets and time. That's a little more kind of not, but the time management or the coordination function is key to making things happen, keeping it going. All these people who are highly educated, doctors, MDs, PhDs, they need to be able to focus on their work, and then the rest of the sort of work is picked up by the project management function. So that's a little different from say, financial services or insurance, where the project managers truly have a larger role to play in that sense.
Okay, interesting. And you mentioned that the SRO is a new term, I suppose, an evolving term. And, you quoted Gartner there. And for instance, their magic quadrant has evolved from the PPM to the SPM, which is more focused around the SRO. And where do you see that going? Do you see the PMO being, I suppose, evolving into the SRO, or do you think they will stay separated going forward?
I think that's a great question. I personally believe that there is a space for the PMO and there's a space for the SRO. So it's not as if when I grow up, I'm going to become an SRO kind of a thing. So it's not as if the next stage of evolution of PMOs is automatically an SRO, and then if you have it, that's utopia. It isn't quite that way. I think there is a space quite for the PMOs as well. The coordination, the different levels, the different levels of interaction is still going to be needed. But where the SRO differentiates itself, in my mind, is the seat at the table at strategy. So if you think about it from strategy perspective, you had the management consulting think tanks which would come and develop strategy for you, and then there was the execution, which was the next level down. And the strategic execution is a space where some companies try to fill up that void, and that's where you evolve from a PMO to a more strategic execution. But the strategy realization office actually is a step above that, in my opinion, where you're sitting and actually deciding whether a project is worth doing or not. So tied up to the goals and the benefits and the strategy of the organization. If you look at the various things, initiatives, the various goals that you're hoping to meet, what projects should support those goals to further those goals up is a seat at the table that the project management office never seemed to have had before. So the PMOs, if you have to have one differentiation between the PMO and the SRO, it would be that. It would be the elevation of the load to even define what the project should be. Is it even worth doing? Should they be done? And that seat at the table is what differentiates an SRO as a starting point. And then there are, of course, other things in terms of things like benefits realization, which PMOs have talked about for many years, well, at least 10 or 15 years that I know of, but don't really quite implement it in the same spirit. So it's benefits realization is truly a thing which strategy realization offices tend to focus on more, because they kind of align themselves to the goals at the organization level itself. And you're looking at how you can further that sort of objectives and goals and stuff of that kind. So I think there is a bit of a sort of overlap, obviously, because SROs could have some PMOs built into them. They could manage projects of their own to keep them going, maybe at least the strategic, unique kind of projects. But the rest of the stuff, you still need the PMO to manage the consistency, the templates, the touch which you need to have, the overall maturity which is needed from a project management standpoint. So I think they're two separate things. There is an overlap, but they're separate.
Yeah, I suppose they work as a synergy, really, don't they? Because you
Absolutely.
can't really have one without the other. Well, especially, top down, you still need the execution piece to align with the
Absolutely.
strategic element. And I
100%.
think, would you agree that the evolution or the birth essentially of the SRO is a clear indicator that C-levels are now much more invested in project management and program management, and they see how it's imperative to meet the strategy that the PMO are involved?
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, this has been the lip service to that has been provided for the last few years, isn't it? So, but I think now it's the realization is more and more firm that you just could not have a project which you decide at the top and say, hey, go forth and make this project happen. Somebody has to sort of make that connection saying, wait a minute, is this really required? I mean, this is something which could be just a continuous improvement thing. It could be an operational change thing. It doesn't need a project, doesn't need a program to support it. So somebody who understands this sort of skill set has to have that skill at the seat at the table. And I think you're absolutely right. That's where the SRO sort of shines, if you will. Yeah, through the realization. Yes.
And avoids the CEO hunch projects.
Well put. A new term for me to learn to use.
Okay, so I suppose, back to the PMO side of things, they are becoming more mature, which you've mentioned. So what does the PMO look like in the future in 10 years' time? So it's not quite the SRO, but do you think it will be different from what it is now?
Yes. There are a few things which I believe are going to have to change. So one is obviously because of the pandemic, and the pandemic was just I mean, I know everybody talks about the pandemic as the obvious sort of trigger point, but it is such a massive impact, isn't it? So like, it has changed the way we work, the way we think, the way we, it has questioned our sacred cows of being in person all the time and stuff of that kind. So if you think of the basic things which the pandemic changed for the PMO, well, firstly, teams are more diverse. They have to be, yeah. So because of the fact that they're virtually, most teams have started operating virtually, and they know, oh, these things can work. So you can have virtual teams. Not that they weren't virtual teams earlier; they were. You did have globally dispersed teams across PMOs, but now it's almost like an imperative. It's almost like every team has to have this virtual component, right? So by that definition, you're automatically getting diverse teams, and that means diverse views. And I mean diverse in the diversity sense of the word, the diversity, inclusion, equity sense. So you are automatically getting teams which are not quite in your location, not quite speak with the same accent as you, a little more diverse. So that is bound to happen. That's one of the changes which I think is driven by the pandemic even more. The second thing is, you used to have the opportunity to say, oh, this is an important meeting, let's meet up face to face at the office. And it was like a thing. So like, if you ever had a need to facilitate something, you would say, let's meet up. And generally that would happen. Even if you had diverse teams, you could maybe do that a little. Now, even for your normal meetings, which need a little bit of a facilitation element, you need to have virtual tools, and you need to get well versed with virtual tools a little more to be able to facilitate. And that skill set is different from what you do when you're standing up. I've been facilitating for so many years now, and I'm used to the sticky notes and the drawing on the whiteboard, and now that the whole thing has changed to sort of not just have the same sticky notes on a virtual machine, but even the techniques have changed because you can't see people's eyes and stuff of that kind, right? So there is that change which is automatically going to be changing the skill sets needed for a PMO or the project manager, right? So diversity is one. Clearly, the tools which you've got are different, and I strongly believe that from that the notion of stakeholder engagement is going to become more pronounced, because who we are trying to to do the projects for is now going to be a little more important than what it used to be earlier. So stakeholding, not that it wasn't important earlier, it just wasn't realized well enough as it is now. So stakeholder engagement, facilitation, and by definition change management, which comes about because languages and diversity throws in changes because of culture and other things which we had not originally thought about. So now we have to think about, oh, the same set of words mean different things in different cultures, and even that is a change that you need to sort of start getting a mastery over in terms of understanding as project managers to get things to happen. So I think certainly these are 2 or 3 of the skills which are obvious to me, which have changed the face of program management in terms of additional skills which are needed, which PMOs did not have to have, but I think now will need to have.
Absolutely. And I even see that in my own job. And I work in marketing, that the team is more global now. And, you do have to adjust your ways and techniques of communication. And even from a workshop and brainstorming, it's just not as easy as, come on, everybody, let's go to the boardroom and draw on the board. So you've got to work smarter, essentially, and keep everyone engaged. So
absolutely,
100% agree that never mind the pandemic, it was a huge piece of it, but it was coming anyway.
Yes.
And especially now with resource and skills shortages, that you have to look further afield to hire the right people. So 100% we have to adapt. And I think we all are, but good things take time, I suppose. One thing you mentioned earlier, Sachin, was operational project management and how it's a bit of a contraindication. So can you tell us a little bit more about that, what you meant by that?
Sure. So by definition, a project is something which has a start and an end, right? And a specific purpose. I mean, that's the classic description of a project, right? Something which has a start and an end and has a specific purpose. So an operation, by its own definition, is something which is ongoing, so that the timeline is already different, right? So by that definition, these two should be completely distinct things. However, there are certain projects which basically are done on an operational cycle, if you will. So for example, if you take, every year, at least in the US, you have, you seek your own benefits, for example, you elect into your benefits at the end of the year. So in between October and maybe December or January, there are project managers which are helping you on an operational level, constantly doing certain things, for in that, to make sure that your benefits elections are correctly done and enrollment happens and so forth. I find that in the healthcare side of things, certainly in the pharmaceutical side of things, there are lots of those kind of project managers, and their skill sets are slightly different from the ones which are needed for the project managers who do one-off and true, and I say true, I'll be careful, classical project management, if you will, right, which have a start and an end. So you have those differences which come about but that to me is where operations and project management overlaps, and that's why I call them operational project managers. But yeah, that's a contradiction of terms otherwise.
Yeah, interesting. Very good. Okay, so we talked earlier, I suppose, about the PMO and how it's not quite going to evolve into the SRO, because there's still going to be a place for both. But you work for a global large enterprise, but I'm sure there is small to medium businesses who want to take elements of SRO and bring them into their PMO because they just can't facilitate both, because they're just not big enough. What tips would you give those people who are in those smaller companies with maybe smaller PMOs who want to bring a flavor of what the SRO does into their PMO?
That's a great question. So I honestly believe that it's easier in smaller companies or medium-sized companies to move from a PMO to an SRO. And the reason for that is because there are less people to convince. So you're and hopefully the layers are not quite as many as they are in larger companies. But clearly the thing to start off is to say, how, even if it's possible, to sort of have a conversation with your top level, with the C levels of some sort, to say, how do we currently decide what kind of work we're going to be charting out, right? And then there is a little bit of convincing which is needed to say, hey, you need us at the seat of the skill set is needed at the table to make the decisions. So while you, the leadership team, could be deciding, on your leadership things which are going forward and how you need to do things, at some points you need to have somebody listening in and weighing in on something which is, yeah, this is good, but I think you're kind of deviating from the strategy that you're laying for yourself. These goals are possible, and we should be, doing something right now, and here's what the ROI is for it. And I think the C-levels will sit up and take notice. Oh, this is exactly what we're missing. We did not. The CEO hunch, as you mentioned it, right? That is not enough to drive projects. It's necessary to set strategy. It's necessary to set goals, but it's not necessary to. I mean, it needs something else to sort of transfer it downward. So I think that discussion can only be had. I mean, this evolution can only be had through discussions with the C-levels. But I think there's a very strong case to be made that that layer is necessary, that connection is necessary to make it onto the standard PM. So I think that's your starting point of the discussion. And of course, then depending on which industry you are and which company, things are probably going to go into different directions.
Okay, very good. Okay, you also mentioned about it from a skills point of view, especially within the PMOs, facilitation, and how that's going to become more important for project managers in the future. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, what that entails, what exactly that, give us a bit of depth and breadth to that facilitation skill.
Sure. So if you start off from the point where your usual project management, usual is general project management so far, which is the additional things which were talked about but missing, if you will, are things like change management, are things like benefits realization, are things like communication to make sure that the right things are being done, and which is sort of dovetails into change management in some cases. All of these things require a certain element of what I call political understanding. Yeah, it's the softer skills. It's the side of things where you need to cajole, you need to manage without having the authority. You need to make sure people understand that what's in it for them and stuff of that kind, which you don't have to do if you're just managing a project by time, schedule, cost, and usual quality. So if you're managing a project purely from that perspective, yes, of course, you have stakeholders to take care of, but you're not quite focused on what the impact is to them. You're not quite focused on who's going to benefit from this, who are the beneficiaries. So traditional project management focused on deliverables. And what I'm thinking as we are going more and more towards the evolved form of project management, it's moving towards outcomes. So it's important that the project gets finished on time. Yes, it's important that the project is finished on budget. Yes, but it's even more important to say, was the intended purpose of the project realized or not? So the outcomes have become more important than the timelines. That's one part of the equation, right? Secondly, why benefits is so important and why it resonates with me so much is because of two reasons. One, benefits can accrue at the beginning of the project right away. So you could even scrap a project when the project is started because the benefit was already accrued, and you didn't even go through the entire deliverable cycle. Or benefits could accrue 10 years from now, right? I mean, you send your kid to school and college because later on in life, they're going to get something good out of it, right? So the benefits are going to be realized later, right? But there could be some benefits which are realized right away, and those are also reasons why you should track them. But the second reason for benefits being such an important thing is beneficiaries. So who are going to benefit from this project? And those can become your allies in making sure that the project becomes successful. And I think that's the piece which I find most fascinating that people are missing, is your stakeholders, your beneficiaries are the ones who can become your allies to make sure your project succeeds. And you're missing that opportunity if you're only focusing on everything other than the stakeholders and beneficiaries and benefits, right? So I think that's the change which I strongly believe in.
And I presume that, and maybe I'm generalizing here, but in a lot of, the classic project managers, that mightn't be the most natural skill for them to have, because it's, it's a bit of cajoling, it's a bit of, engaging people, getting buy-in. It's more of you're nearly a salesperson for your project in a sense.
Absolutely.
So that's
spot on. I mean, I actually broke down project management skills into four buckets, if you will, if I can just put it out over there, right? So to me, you have four buckets of project management skills. One is, of course, pure play project management, right? The things which you do as, the PMP certification related things, right? So the things that you do around that for managing projects, planning and time and schedule and all other good stuff. So you need to have that agnostic of whatever project, whatever PMO, you need to have that. The second bunch of skills is what I call technical skills, and those are not necessary for everybody to have, but that's where that SME and the PhDs in some cases, and those are. So there are some skills of that kind which are needed, not all of them, but there are various degrees of skills needed in that bucket. The third thing which we are now seeing getting more and more important is the technology skills, right? So once upon a time, you could do with a centralized PM tool and a couple of things of that kind. That was your technology, right? But now you have to think about online tools, virtual tools, and making things happen. So there's those set of skills which need to be improved upon. So that's the third bucket, the technology skills. And then there's the fourth bucket, which is always there, but is kind of getting more obvious. That's the political skills. The political skills around facilitation, persuasion, change management, influencing, in a potentially a virtual world, which brings out another layer of things over there. So that's a skill set which I think needs also to be developed. So if you take these four buckets of skills, the first bucket, the pure play project management skills, are something which everybody believes is project management. So you get into that and say you have to have that. True, of course, that's the you need to have that. But in various levels, you need to have these other skills as well. And depending on the kind of projects and the kind of industry you are in, those are required in various levels. But you do need to have an assortment of all of them. So coming back to the facilitation part and the persuasion part, the salesman thing that you need to get into, that's the political box which I'm talking about, which I think is getting more and more, sort of evolved, if you will, as in most other projects. So
yeah, very interesting. Okay, thank you. So look, I suppose the topic of this podcast is how to run an SRO in a large life sciences company. So my final question is around, and you mentioned like the purpose of the SRO is to take the corporate vision and essentially turn that into an action plan. How do you do that?
That's a great question again. So I think initially, I'll give you an example, I guess, to start with. Many years ago, and this was, to me, the genesis of my understanding of what needed to happen. So many years ago, I got an opportunity to take to be a part of transformation of one of the world's largest retail companies, and I won't name it. But they were going from, their IT was going through a transformation because of a new CIO coming in. And she laid down a vision of having, instead of having 123 or whatever number of vendors who are going to supply people project management skills or IT skills, you're going to have only 9 strategic partners, right? And you say, okay, so that's the vision. So you're going to say that means those strategic partners would have a bigger say in management of the IT. They would be able to do a better job. There would be synergies that they could bring to bear. All of the ideas was beautiful. So that was the goal, that was the setup, right? Now, how do you take something like that and transfer that into projects, right? So at the goal level, this was the stated objective, the stated goal. Now, how do you make this into projects, right? So then you start thinking about, so what are the various things which you have to touch to make this happen? What are the various, and obviously the things that we do as project managers is now put on steroids, and you do the same thing, but do them a little differently. So for example, risk management, right? You look and say, okay, so in doing this, what are the challenges that you're going to be facing? What are the risks that you're dealing with? Oh, you may need to transfer some portfolio from one of the stakeholders currently who's managing it to another, because now you've got this, aligned along the bucket over here. So what's that going to be entailed? That's going to be something which you need to have a project which will manage that, to sort of say, how will you handle those changes which are coming from moving portfolios across, or gaining a portfolio, or divesting a portfolio for one of those 9 partners, right? So you start looking at things from that perspective. So risk is one classic lens that you can look at project and say, okay, what are the things that could break when you're doing this conversion, and how do you manage that? That's one aspect of it. Then, of course, the bread and butter set of things that you need to look at and say, oh, this is going to, what are the benefits that you're going to expect from this? And you look at it and you start deriving the benefits. So you say, well, you're going to get better portfolio management, better handling of the constituents, better stakeholder management in some cases. So who are the beneficiaries? So you draw, sort of stakeholder maps, if you will, right? To sort of say, if you had this as a black box and you had various stakeholders who are either providing input or taking something out, who are they? And you start drawing this map and it becomes a huge map, and you start saying, okay, so how do you handle things around that? Who are the benefit? What are the benefits? What are the beneficiaries? So they drive the next set of things. So there's a long answer to this, but the short answer to this is you drive it from the things that you do know about. You know about risk, you know about benefits, you know about outcomes, and you use that as lenses to start cutting down the projects and start breaking them into actionable projects, if you will. And there's an entire webinar I had spoken at on this very subject of converting projects, how to get projects out of there, but that's probably for another day.
Okay, so you got to nearly get the marker out, start drawing
Yes.
it out and getting the full picture, and
Absolutely.
then wielding it into a plan.
Absolutely, because it's and that's the reason why I always felt fascinated when somebody handed me a project to say, hey, take this project and go around. Wait a minute, how did this project come into being in the first place, right? So that was the thing which interested me more, and that's why the SRO, with the skill sets that you already have as project managers, becomes the right place to sort of look at it and say, really, this project is not even going to be needed, or this project is extremely important. How didn't you even identify this as an important one, right? So I think that's the part where you bring a little more professional insights and professional management into taking what's a bucket of projects somewhere over there, which are amorphously defined, and make them into a little more crystallized, sort of clear-cut projects with their own objectives, each with their own sponsors and outcomes that you're expecting, right?
So all the pieces, the jigsaw pieces, when you put them together, and that's what the SRO's job is, essentially, to take all the little pieces that will make up the bigger picture, which is the corporate vision or the strategy, and how they all fit together and feed into each other and benefit the overall corporate vision.
My God, you just summed up everything that it took 25 minutes to speak about in a sentence. Beautifully done.
Really, really interesting stuff, Sachin. And you mentioned there that you have spoken about that particular topic on a webinar before. So we might even share those details with listeners if they wanted to listen back. But I know you speak at a good few conferences. So do you have anything coming up where people might be able to come and hear you speak more about the topic?
Sure. There's one coming up in June, on the 7th and 8th of June in Philadelphia. And this is and again, a healthcare-based project and portfolio management conference. So I'll be talking over there about the PM skills needed in the future, which is one of the topics which you touched on today.
Excellent. So. Well, we will link to maybe your LinkedIn account in our show notes so that people can maybe connect with you and find out more. But thank you so much, Sachin, for joining us today on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Susanne. It was delightful chatting with you, and I loved the way you quickly caught on to the high points that I took so long to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care now. Bye.